74,000 years ago, the sky turned to ash. Not for a day, not for a week, for years. A volcano in what is now Indonesia detonated with a force so massive, it remains, to this day, the single largest volcanic eruption anywhere on Earth in the last 2 million years. 5,000 times larger than Mount St. Helens. An explosion so powerful that ash from it has been found buried in soil on the opposite side of the planet. And for decades, scientists believed this single event nearly ended the human story before it really began. They called it the Toba catastrophe. The theory was simple and genuinely terrifying. The eruption pumped so much sulfur and ash into the atmosphere that it triggered what researchers call a volcanic winter. Global temperatures plunging by as much as 14 degrees Fahrenheit for years, possibly decades. Vegetation collapsing, food chains unraveling, a dying world. Some scientists calculated that the entire human species may have been reduced to just a few thousand survivors. Think about that number for a second. Not a few million, not a few 100,000, a few thousand. If that number is accurate, every single human being alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from a population smaller than the crowd at a high school football game. We were, by this account, one bad season away from not existing at all. For years, this was the accepted story. A near-extinction event. Humanity clinging on by its fingernails. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange. Because in the last several years, archaeologists have started digging up evidence that tells a very different, and in some ways far more remarkable story. Let's start with what actually happened when the ash began to fall. Picture it. You're an early human living somewhere in Africa or the Middle East. You have no warning. No seismologists tracking pressure beneath a distant island. One day the sky simply darkens. Ash begins to drift down like gray snow, coating everything. Water sources, plants, the animals you hunt. The sun dims. It stays dim. Days pass, then weeks. The temperature keeps dropping. Everything you've ever known about which plants fruit in which season, which animals migrate where, starts becoming unreliable because the entire climate has been thrown into chaos. This is the scenario ancient humans were facing. And here's what should genuinely astonish you. At a site called Pinnacle Point, on the southern coast of what is now South Africa, archaeologists uncovered something remarkable. A layer of ash, chemically matched to the Toba eruption, sitting directly within a sequence of human habitation. Not a gap, not an interruption. Continuous human occupation before the eruption, during it, and after it. And it gets stranger. Human activity at this site didn't decline after Toba. It increased. Researchers found evidence of new technological innovation appearing in the archaeological layers immediately following the eruption. Not a population in collapse, but a population actively adapting. So how did they do it? The answer lies partly in where they were standing. The South African coastline, researchers now believe, may have functioned as what scientists call a refugium, a survival pocket, a place where local conditions remained survivable even while the broader global climate was in crisis. Coastal environments offered something inland regions couldn't: the ocean. While inland food sources were failing under ash and cold, the sea kept producing. Shellfish, fish, a food source that didn't depend on seasonal rainfall or sunlight reaching struggling plants. Humans at Pinnacle Point appear to have leaned harder into coastal foraging exactly when they needed it most, turning to the one food source the volcanic winter couldn't easily destroy. But the coast wasn't the only place people were surviving. And what happened elsewhere might be even more remarkable. At a site called Shinfa-Metema 1 in the lowlands of Ethiopia, nowhere near an ocean, archaeologists led by researcher John Kappelman found something extraordinary. As the volcanic winter dragged on and rainfall patterns collapsed, rivers that once flowed year-round began drying into a scattered series of shrinking waterholes during increasingly long dry seasons. For most animals, this would be a death sentence. Water sources disappearing meant food sources disappearing right alongside them. But ancient humans at this site did something remarkable. As the waterholes shrank, they realized these disappearing pools were concentrating fish into smaller and smaller spaces. Fish that would normally be spread across a full river were now trapped in huge numbers in shrinking, isolated pockets of water. Researchers found a dramatic spike in fish consumption at exactly this period. As the environment collapsed around them, this group didn't retreat. They adapted their entire diet in real time to exploit a resource that only existed because everything else was falling apart. And here's the detail that should genuinely stop you. At this same site, archaeologists uncovered some of the earliest solid evidence of bow and arrow technology anywhere in the archaeological record, emerging in these same layers during this exact period of crisis. Let that sink in for a moment. While the world was, by some accounts, on the verge of ending, at least one group of ancient humans was busy inventing one of the most important weapons technologies our species would ever create. Not despite the disaster. Possibly because of it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, in northern India, a completely different site was telling archaeologists something equally striking. At a location called Dhaba, researchers led by Chris Clarkson uncovered stone tools spanning a continuous stretch of time, from well before the Toba eruption to well after it. And the tools didn't change. Not dramatically, not in a way that would suggest a population being wiped out and slowly, painfully rebuilt from near zero by unrelated survivors generations later. The same toolkit, the same techniques, a continuous, unbroken thread of human technological knowledge running straight through the supposed apocalypse. If the Toba catastrophe theory were fully accurate, if humanity really had been reduced to a scattered handful of survivors, you would expect to see technology collapse and slowly, awkwardly rebuild itself from scratch. That's not what the evidence shows. It shows continuity. So now we have 3 sites, on 3 different continents, each telling a version of the same underlying story. Not collapse, adaptation, innovation, continuity. Which raises an obvious question. Was the Toba catastrophe theory just wrong? Here's where I have to be honest with you because this is where the story gets genuinely more interesting than a simple yes or no answer. The debate isn't actually settled. Some researchers still argue that Toba's climate effects were severe and genuinely dangerous. That coastal refugia, like Pinnacle Point, represent exactly the kind of narrow survival pockets you'd expect if most of the rest of the world really was becoming uninhabitable. Under this view, the human story isn't Toba was survivable everywhere. It's Toba was catastrophic almost everywhere, and only a handful of specific, resource-rich locations kept the species alive at all. Other researchers, pointing to sites like Dhaba, argue the opposite, that the climate impact has been significantly overstated, that Toba's ash cooled the planet by a modest amount rather than triggering a true world-ending winter, and that human populations across multiple continents simply weathered it without ever coming close to the brink of extinction. The honest answer right now is that scientists are still actively arguing about which version is closer to the truth. But here's what both sides actually agree on, and it's the part of this story that matters most. Wherever ancient humans were, whatever the true severity of the crisis they faced, the response was the same. They didn't just endure. They adapted, specifically and rapidly, to whatever their local environment was still offering. Coastal groups turned to the sea. Inland groups near shrinking rivers turned to concentrated fishing. And at least one group, facing one of the greatest environmental crises our species had ever encountered, used that exact moment of crisis to invent new technology that would eventually spread and reshape human hunting forever. This is where the real lesson of Toba lives. Not in a simple story of near extinction, and not in a simple story of nothing bad happening at all. It lives in the pattern underneath both stories. When the environment ancient humans knew completely and totally failed them, their instinct wasn't paralysis. It was observation, followed immediately by adaptation. Watch what's changing. Figure out what's still available. Build something new if you have to. That instinct, the ability to look at a completely unprecedented world-altering crisis and respond not with despair, but with immediate practical experimentation, didn't disappear when the ash finally settled and the skies cleared, decades or centuries later. It's the same instinct that let human populations eventually spread into literally every climate on Earth. Arctic tundra, equatorial rainforest, high-altitude mountains where the air itself is thin enough to kill you. Deserts where water might not fall from the sky for years at a time. Every single one of those environments required exactly the same core skill Toba appears to have demanded and tested. Watch, adapt, build something new. Geologists studying Earth's volcanic history are clear about one uncomfortable fact. An eruption on the scale of Toba isn't a one-time historical anomaly. It's a recurring category of event, one that will, statistically, happen again someday. We simply don't know when. If it does, the modern world it happens to will look nothing like the scattered hunter-gatherer bands who faced it 74,000 years ago. But the fundamental challenge will be exactly the same. A familiar environment, suddenly and completely unrecognizable. Old assumptions about food, water, and safety no longer holding true. Your ancestors faced exactly that scenario, with none of the science, none of the infrastructure, and none of the collective knowledge modern humans now have access to. And whether the true story is one of humanity brought to the very edge of extinction and clawing its way back from a few thousand survivors, or one of a resilient species barely breaking stride through the largest volcanic disaster in 2 million years. Either way, the outcome was the same. They didn't just survive the ash. Somewhere in the middle of the worst environmental catastrophe their world had ever seen, at least one small group of ancient humans picked up a stick, a string, and a sharpened point, and invented a weapon that would still be in use tens of thousands of years later. That instinct is still in you. The next time everything familiar about your world suddenly stops making sense, you won't need to reinvent the bow and arrow. But somewhere in your biology, the same ancient response is still sitting there, quietly waiting. Watch. Adapt. Build something new. It's the reason there's still anyone here, 74,000 years later, to tell this story at all. Our ancestors didn't survive because the world was kind. They survived because they learned faster than the world could destroy them. History didn't disappear. It became you. This is Anchoria,